I'm Jim,
And I'm Garrett.
and this is
Jim and
Jim and
Garrett at
Garrett at
the
the
movies.
movies. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Jim and Garrett at the movies, and we are going to be all zombie landing all of the time. We'll be reviewing the sequel to the Zombieland 2 Double Tap and to the original Zombieland movie. We will be talking about that as our movie club entry, and then we'll also address the latest comments from the old men who are yelling at clouds, Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola and their criticisms of comic book films. But first, Zombieland Double Tap, the newest entry from Ruben Fleischer and starring the old cast of Woody Harrelson, Jesse Eisenberg, Emma Stone, and Abigail Breslin, with new entries by Zoe Deutsch and Rosario Dawson, including a couple jump-ins from Luke Wilson and Thomas Middleditch. This picks up the gang approximately 10 years after the original, which is, in keeping with the chronology, both in real life and in the movie world. And a couple of them are getting a little restless, and adventures ensue as a result of two leaving the gang and whatnot. So I'll turn it over to you, Garrett. What did you think of Zombieland Double Tap?
Zombieland Double Tap is a film that has everything. It's got comedy, it's got action, it's got zombies, it's got Bill Murray, it's got everything you want in a film, with the exception of a reason to exist. I
I thought you were. I was like, oh my God, he's actually liked this movie. How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's tongue in cheek, but only somewhat tongue in cheek. I mean, everything I said, and that is true. There's humor, there's good action, there's good cinematography. The cast has real chemistry. There's good comic timing. On the mechanical level, everything sort of works. But the thing is that I have no idea why anyone thought we wanted more of this or wanted to say more of this. If you wanted to put it in Zombieland terms, there are certain rules you need if you're going to be doing a sequel. And one of them is to have something to do that wasn't done in the first one. You want to raise the stakes in some way. You want to continue the character arcs in a new direction. You want to explore a part of the world that you hadn't explored before, but that you had set up in the first one. There's got to be something, a reason to come back to these characters in this place, and that just doesn't exist here. I was perfectly content with the first Zombieland, and I really felt like it was going back to a dry well for Double Tap.
Yeah, I basically agree, although I think I'm a little more down on the film than you are. It's an on-recommend eventually. When we get to our star ratings, you'll see. But one of the things that was mentioned in the honest trailer for the original Zombieland was that the film was originally conceived as a loosely stitched together narrative around a bunch of zombie themed skits or sketches rather. And it was essentially some comic bits that they stitched a plot together, and that was the movie. And it feels like Zombieland Double Tap is a loosely stitched together collection of zombie themed sketches that are somehow less. It's like this is the bottom of the barrel, or the last pieces of paper in the hat of ideas, and that was what Zombieland Double Tap ended up being. And in that sense, I found it to be underwhelming. I didn't find it to be all that funny. And I think you're right that there's not much of a reason for this film to exist. It's only after I rewatched the first Zombieland that I was able to kind of pitch together a better version of this. And that might be, I know I'm throwing a curveball at you, but I almost want to say, challenge, pitch a Zombieland 2 that's better than this Zombieland, because this one just doesn't work.
Yeah, and I mean, the first thing to do to improve it is to take out the things that they thought were going to improve it in the first place. So I mentioned stakes raising a second ago. They attempt to raise the stakes by having the zombies evolve, and then there's different kinds of zombies, and that just seems uninteresting and lazy. I mean, there's a couple, I guess, of semi-decent jokes in there that could have been pulled off, but definitely weren't worth the idea that somehow we're supposed to be more concerned for the well-being of our heroes because now the zombies have evolved or something like that. So I would start by taking away alleged improvements like that and try to and go back to the drawing board and try to find something different that would play that role of getting us reinvested in the danger.
Or have some of those raised stakes pay off. I mean, it feels like they use that in the introduction. They say, okay, the zombies have evolved. Great. All right. So now I'm waiting for the evolved zombies to present more of a challenge to our heroes than the original zombies did in the original Zombieland, and they just don't. The original zombies in the original Zombieland are target practice, or in some cases, they are just swarms that our heroes end up able to vanquish relatively easily. But in this Zombieland, they present literally the same challenge for our heroes. So if those raised stakes had paid off, I would be okay with it. They don't.
Yeah.
Um,
Another thing they try to do is they try to add new characters, which, okay, that's a standard thing you do. There's a character in this film whose sole comedic purpose seems to be to be the butt of a whole bunch of hackneyed, dumb blonde jokes,
yep.
which would have seemed tired in the early 90s and now are just awful. I mean, for what they're worth, they're well executed from the point of view of the actor's part, and from the editing and the timing, and again, all those mechanical parts are just fine. But the writing is tired, and I have to imagine that there are other characters you could have added into the mix that would have both deepened sort of the emotional gravity of the story and also just been funnier.
Hmm. I like Rosario Dawson's edition. I liked her. I thought she was. I like how she sort of plays off of the group, and I think she's got some badass moments in this that I really enjoyed. So I'll give the film Rosario Dawson, but the character that you're referring to, I completely agree. It's dumb blonde jokes, and where that doesn't play in 2019, and it doesn't play even the way it's written in 2009. If they had done that character in 2009, I don't think that would have been it would have it still wouldn't have worked. So
Well, again, I want to be generous, and I want to stress that there are merits in this film. I mean, there's several action sequences that are very well choreographed and shot. The overall sort of sense that our four sort of core main characters are sort of, they care about each other, they're connected, they're a strange sort of, family of sorts in the post-apocalyptic world. Again, it works. This would have seemed like a direct-to-video sequel were it not for the fairly high quality production values that the film has. So again, for all of that, I don't understand why these actors, talented actors, funny actors, why they chose to come back for this screenplay, which is neither particularly interesting nor particularly funny.
I agree, and yeah, I think you're right on. And I do think let's talk about those production values. There's a one shot in here that's fantastic. There's an action sequence in here that's really well choreographed and really well shot. Jesse Eisenberg is doing Jesse Eisenberg things. Emma Stone returns to the character quite well. Woody Harrelson is doing Woody Harrelson things. It's all competently done on behalf of on the part of the creatives. Once you sort of allow for the fact that the script kind of sucks. Um, so I'll throw my pitch for Zombieland 2 at you first, and if you want to bounce off of this, feel free. the first Zombieland is all about, it's more about family than the fucking Fast and Furious franchise is. The first Zombieland is all, and that's something that the Honest Trailers, I really shouldn't have watched the Honest trailer because I'm just going to sort of steal all of their observations. Um, but it's about family. And what raises the stakes of family any more than one of them is pregnant and going to have a child? And you're gonna have a child in the middle of the zombie apocalypse. And of course, I think it would be the Jesse Eisenberg and Emma Stone characters who should be calling each other by their actual names at this point. They've lived 10 years together and they're still calling each other Tallahassee, Wichita, and Columbus and Little Rock. What?
I disagree
You
with
don't
that.
think so?
I think their identities have been reinvented in the apocalypse. These are their real names now. The old life they left behind, they leave those old names behind too. I think actually that makes perfect sense.
I disagree because at the end of Zombieland, we get that moment where she says her real name to him. So I don't think that identity is completely dead if it means something that she says Krista in his ear. Um, but yeah, I think that as soon as you start with that as the inciting incident to your movie, then you can do a lot more. Okay, we need to find someplace more secure, where the place where we're living, and I won't give away that joke because even though it's in the first act, it's kind of funny and a bit of a surprise. Um, even though the place where we're living is relatively secure, we need to find a more secure place. And then they go off on road trip to find more secure place, run into various characters, and then you play with that relationship and the relative lack of commitment on both of the Jesse Eisenberg, on both the part of Wichita and Columbus's characters. I think that ends up being a better movie with raised stakes. And of course, I would love to see Tallahassee go, I'm going to be a grandfather. Like, I think Woody Harrelson would play that well. And you start there, and then instead of loosely stitched together zombie sketches, you have an actual story. And I would be there for that movie. Or you start and they already have a child. So it's like four people and a baby in the zombie apocalypse. I'm in on that. How do you raise the stakes? You throw a baby in there. And that could be a more interesting sequel. What do you think?
The film definitely needs a better core. There needs to be an idea behind it. The idea behind the first Zombieland film was a good one. It's sort of a sort of meta deconstruction of zombie stories, which were particularly hot at the time in which the first movie came out, and it sort of did something like what Scream did for the slashers, only a little bit more comedic, where it sort of holds a mirror up to the tropes that these stories play, and turns them into comic fodder, and it did it reasonably well. So what do you do for the sequel then? You have to take that same sort of concept of holding a mirror up to these tropes, but not hold that mirror up to the exact same tropes. So if you think about a show like The Walking Dead, the conceit behind The Walking Dead is that the zombies aren't the real enemy. It's the other human beings that are the real enemy. The Walking Dead of the title, of course, famously refers to the human survivors, not to the zombies. So you could turn that on its head in some way. Or you could, if you wanted to go in a different direction, you could go in the direction of I Am Legend, right? Where and in the end of I Am Legend, you find out that it's the surviving human.
Spoilers for I Am Legend.
Yeah.
Spoilers for I Am Legend.
The novella's been out for 60 years now. If you haven't read it by now, you're behind the curve. But anyway.
At the end of I Am Legend, go ahead.
At the end of
I missed it because I was spoiler warning you.
Right. Yeah. At the end of I Am Legend, we find out the soul-surviving human actually turns out to be the monster, and it's the zombie-like creatures actually have started their own civilization, and they view him as the creature that lives in the castle that needs to be destroyed. That's a great inversion of a lot of tropes like vampire and zombie stories. You could do a comic inversion of that. You could take these tropes that have been explored in these stories that the first Zombieland didn't turn around, and use them as fodder for trying to find your meta humor. So I mean, in I think it's the first, maybe the second season of Walking Dead, one of the characters is pregnant, and again, they play that for high tension, high drama. How do you survive? It's genuinely scary. If you can figure out a way to turn that into comedy, that could really work well. You have to find a different set of ideas to work the story around. It can't just be, we have a few more ideas for some sketches, let's see how they work.
Right. Well, I would watch both of our versions of Zombieland 2 more than I would watch this one. What would you give this one out of 5?
Two.
I'm at 1.5. For all of the reasons that we listed. What about let's talk about the original Zombieland. This is our movie club entry. I rewatched it for the podcast, so did you. What did you think of it on the rewatch?
It's I was sort of taken by surprise when I saw it the first time. I thought it sounded pretty lame, to be perfectly honest, and it exceeded my initial expectations. And that was sort of on the strength of again, that's sort of the sort of witty meta humor that I mentioned a second ago, the strong cast, and this sort of deconstruction of a lot of these sort of zombie tropes that generally works pretty well. On the rewatch, I found myself a little less enthused, perhaps because I had raised my impression of it and then sort of had forgotten exactly what why it was that I had the low expectations and then was overimpressed, and so I ended up sort of overshooting my expectations and being a little disappointed. And that's in part because of my own sort of adjusted expectations, and in part just because I think in a lot of ways the sort of material that it's sending up has sort of moved on, and it feels a little stale. So while, again, on its merits, it still is a generally strong film, it also, I think, is very much showing its age. It's a product of a time that was right for its time, but now doesn't quite hold up so well.
And you didn't watch the Honest trailer, and yet that's literally the joke that they make in the Honest trailer. That this is the most 2009 movie of 2009. You got World of Warcraft, Mountain Dew Code Red, like that. That's the joke that they make in the Honest trailer, and yet you didn't even watch it. So great minds, great minds. Yeah, I think that the film skates by on the charm of its actors. I think Emma Stone, Jesse Eisenberg, Woody Harrelson, Abigail Breslin are all fantastic in this movie, and that's why it succeeds more than anything else. And of course, surprise Bill Murray. That's fantastic as well. I think it works because the actors are so charming, and I do like some of the sketches, and it's able to stitch together these sketches in a less ham-handed way than Zombieland 2 is. I think that there's a thing that this character struggles with, that Columbus struggles with and wants. He wants a family. He wants to get to his family. He wants to find belonging with other people because the rest of the world is dead. That makes perfect sense to me. And because he has that motivation that sort of works as a through line throughout the entire film, it ends up it ends up holding together a lot better than the Zombieland 2. So I ended up really liking this movie. Do you have any I ended up liking this movie well enough. Do you have any other things to say about it before we close up shop?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that the creativity behind it is definitely strong, and they could have taken maybe a similar sort of style of humor and I know gone in a new direction with it, maybe by I mean, I'm imagining like a Vampire Land or something like that. Or it seems like a knockoff when I'm just sort of throwing it out there. But there are other opportunities for the creative energies that they're sort of harnessing here. In a lot of ways, Zombieland kind of feels like a series of sketches. You might even call it like a demo tape in some ways, in which they're sort of showing off a demo tape of some really talented filmmakers. But it's more proof of concept, I think, than it is sort of a whole baked sort of story. There's a beginning and a middle and an end. There's all the sort of necessary parts to it, of course. But at the same time, it doesn't feel like there's a whole lot of investment. Now, granted, it's an action comedy. It's not supposed to sort of have a lot of emotional gravity to it. So maybe that's not the most fair of criticisms. But at the same time, I think the comedies that work the best are the ones that have heart. And there's not a whole lot of heart here. I mean, it's not heartless. Again, there's charm from the actors, like you mentioned. I certainly agree with that. But I never sort of feel in a whole ways sort of emotionally invested in any of the characters to the point where I would particularly care if one of them died.
I disagree with that because I do think that the film has heart, and it's that search for family that I was just talking about. I think that's where the film finds its heart, and it's played off in the performance by Eisenberg, who I think is, I mean, in 2009 he was just coming into his own. He hadn't done Social Network yet, and or Lex Luthor, but he is. I think he pulls this off, and he's sort of the connective tissue that gives the film heart for me. So for that reason, I might be rating it a little higher than you are. What do you give it out of 5?
Out of 5, I give it 3.
I give it 3.5, and for the reasons I just articulated. All right.
There's actually there's a fair bit of Academy Award power in this cast, isn't there? I mean,
Eisenberg with a nomination, Stone with a win. I don't know about Woody Harrelson and Abigail Breslin. Woody Harrelson's been nominated for 3. He hasn't won any, and Abigail Breslin was nominated for Little Miss Sunshine. Yeah. So yeah, that's Abigail Breslin. All 3 of them have been nominated for Oscars with 1 win between the 4 of them. All 4 of them have been nominated for Oscars with 1 win. So, all right, let us move on to the next little bit, and that is the latest comments from Francis Ford Coppola, who is backing up his friend Martin Scorsese. Scorsese has been quoted as saying that Marvel films are nothing but theme parks, not real cinema. He also admitted that he hasn't watched a Marvel film. Francis Ford Coppola agrees and said that Marvel films are, quote, despicable. Well, let's go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to you and get your sort of gut reactions first on how you respond to these comments, and then we'll try to delve maybe a little bit deeper than simply calling these two legendary filmmakers as simply old men yelling at clouds, as I said before.
yeah, I mean, obviously they're both legends, titans, amongst the best living filmmakers around. But you don't have to be a phenomenal filmmaker to be entitled to your opinion. Not everyone has to like any film or any particular genre of film, and they are perfectly entitled to say that this kind of film doesn't do it for them. That having been said, it is rather strange to me that these appear to be comments made in ignorance. They appear to be commented based on the trailers, I suppose, and not actually having watched the films. There, to give it as much sort of weight as I suppose I can, the criticism seems fair maybe of some of the superhero films, but not so much of others. I mean, when I first heard Scorsese say the comment about it's not cinema of people trying to connect with each other emotionally or whatever the exact line was, I thought of Lindsay Ellis's rather impressive video essay on the hard feels about Guardians of the Galaxy 2. And I think that Lindsay Ellis did a fantastic job of showing the emotional texture and the details and the nuances and the conflict and how that resonated with her as an audience member. And I mean, in some ways, I want to say I think Scorsese should watch her essay and then go watch Guardians of the Galaxy 2 and come back and say if he still feels the same way. I mean, I'm not 100% convinced it would change his mind, but I think he would at least respect the perspective a little bit more.
Right. And the comments being ignorance is a bit of a problem associated with both these things. And I think to sort of get to your point, Chris Stuckman tweeted something that I thought was really interesting, and that was, he said, journalists, instead of asking legendary filmmakers what they think of Marvel movies, try asking them why they're having such a hard time funding their films. And this was after he also tweeted that a journalist asked legendary auteur about Marvel movies, hoping to get a sellable headline, and gets it. It's he's basically this is sort of bump set Spike as it comes to entertainment journalism right now, where they say, "Oh, I'm going to tee off Martin Scorsese to talk about Marvel films in hopes to get a real quote," and of course they get it, and then sort of excite the masses for a little while. But I think Stuckman's on the right track, where instead of just talking about Marvel films qua Marvel films, we should talk about what is really going on here, and what possible criticisms we could legitimately have about what Marvel film success has done to the film landscape, which I think is a much more interesting discussion and a much more interesting set of questions for Scorsese and Coppola.
So there's two things going on there. One which I think is definitely worth talking about, and one which I think is not, or if it is for a meta reason. So if I understand the criticism, and I'm not sure it's necessarily the one that Stuckman or you were making, but I have heard it made by several people, and I want to call it out, is people are criticizing the journalists for asking Scorsese his opinion about these things as though that's lazy journalism. To my mind, that's a hypocritical criticism. It's a lazy criticism of journalists to say that you shouldn't be asking Scorsese or people like him their opinions of Marvel movies. That's a perfectly legit question for a journalist to ask. Now, you call it sort of a bump set Spike. Yeah, journalists need to hustle too. They need to make sure that they get people reading their stuff and talking about their stuff. And in that respect, it's been a success. But the fact that it's been successful, and the fact that it didn't require a whole lot from the journalist to ask that question, is neither here nor there. I am genuinely interested in what Scorsese thinks of the Marvel films. I would be more interested if he'd actually seen them. But if he saw them and he hated them and he said that they were bad, I would want to know. I don't think it's lazy journalism or bad journalism to get his input or any notable filmmaker's input on projects like this. So as criticism of entertainment journalism, I think that's a bullshit criticism. But to your other point about how allegedly, potentially, the Marvel universe is sort of sucking all the air out of the room and making it harder for other films to get funding and to get audiences and to get made. That is more complicated, more interesting, and more nuanced. I'm obviously not an expert on the econometrics of Hollywood, and I don't know exactly how these relationships work. I'm skeptical of the thesis that Marvel being such a huge hit makes it harder for other filmmakers to get funding and to make films or to find audiences. Again, that might be true, but I require some convincing of that.
Sure. There have been several takes that suggest that this is the reason why Scorsese is moving to Netflix, because and in fact, one of the takes on Joker was that in order to tell Taxi Driver in 2009 film, or check that, in order to tell Taxi Driver in the 2019 film economy, you have to put it in the guise of a comic book movie. So in order to tell a Taxi Driver story, it has to be the Joker.
Yeah, that's obviously false. I mean, that statement right there is, to me, mind, just obviously false. There are tons of movies that have explored themes similar to Taxi Driver in the last decade. The film that's jumping out at me, I think, is a little further back in the last decade, but it's History of Violence. But that is doing something similar in some ways. I am quite confident that if a filmmaker of what's the director of Joker, what's his name again? Todd Phillips.
Todd Phillips.
Quite confident that if Todd Phillips wanted to tell a Taxi Driver-esque story that had nothing to do with the DC universe or any Marvel comic universe, A, I'd probably like that movie more, and B, he could get it done. Maybe the checks wouldn't come quite so fast, but on the other hand, there wouldn't be intellectual property red tape to deal with either, so it actually might come quicker.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. That's sort of an interesting takedown of that argument. I wonder whether or not this also has something to do with the theater model. Right now, ticket sales are actually up. Ticket sales are up, but they're concentrated in the Marvel films, and they're concentrated in the big event films rather than being sort of spread out across or multiple releases in a single year.
Important clarification: up over what period? Up compared to last year, compared to the last 10-year average?
Yeah, so if you look at the graph of ticket sales, there's a strong drop in the mid 2000s, and there's a spike in the most recent years, basically after 2008, which of course is the highlight of the beginning of the MCU. Now, the MCU didn't start as the MCU. Iron Man was a successful film, but it was not, the ginormous juggernaut that Avengers Endgame was, which broke all of the records. Well, many of the records, didn't break all of them. So yeah, I think that one can take a look at the current film landscape and be a little cautious about how films that are essentially spectacle are dominating the landscape and dominating what people are going to the theater to see, not necessarily what people are seeing as a whole. I mean, certainly it is. It's hard to measure this. Like there's no sort of reliable data on this. But I would think that people are watching more film entertainment these days than they were in Scorsese's heyday. That is to say, because they have Netflix readily available, they may be watching more movies. But I sort of liken it this way. People are reading more words these days because we're primarily communicating through social media or through text messages and whatnot. People are writing more these days. People are reading more words are getting into people's eyes these days than in the 1980s and the 1970s. But just because they're reading doesn't mean they're not reading books, though. In the 70s, 80s, people were reading books and magazines and other literature written by authors who cared about the written word. And now we're reading social media posts and text messages. So just because we are seeing more words doesn't necessarily mean that we are reading better stuff. And so I think the same thing can be sort of flipped into the argument about film. The 70s were, for my money, the best decade in the history of American film. And just because people are seeing more movies these days doesn't mean they're seeing more good movies.
Yeah, I can't say with confidence that your assessment there is mistaken or wrong, but I am skeptical of it because it strikes me as being a sort of a kind of cognitive fallacy that you see in a lot of areas. There's a name for it. I can't remember exactly what it is, but I can make the point this way. There was a lot of terrible movies made in the 70s. There was a lot of terrible movies made in the 80s, and there was a lot of illiterate people who didn't read in either decade. So
True.
the sort of looking back at these previous decades and saying, "Oh, those were the golden years. Why aren't we doing it like that anymore?" Again, maybe there is something real there, but to my mind, I want to see something that is data driven before I start coming to the conclusion that things were so much better way back when. I would sort of also add to the fact that, I mean, again, this has nothing to do with the Marvel movies directly, but it is coexisting with them. There are a lot more young filmmakers out there who are experimenting with their own shit just because they can make them on their own. They can make them with their phones. They can edit them on their home computers. They can post them on YouTube. There's so much more room for people to create in their own ways without having to rely on the expensive equipment or even at a certain point a studio system where you can just do what you want to do because you have a passion for it. Now again, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be quality stuff out there. But at the same time, you're not going to get quality stuff unless you have a lot of people with the freedom and the opportunity to explore and experiment and to try their hands at making films. And maybe some of those people who start off making, I mean, you think about these stories, right, about Steven Spielberg when he was a kid, right, when he got his first Super 8 and how he was experimenting with making movies and movie techniques and stuff like that. And then he grew up to become Steven fucking Spielberg. Well, the Spielberg of the next generation or whatever is probably going to start on an iPhone somewhere. So while it's tempting to sort of say that this is a pessimistic point in the history of cinema because of lots of reasons, not the least of which is Marvel, that can crowd out reasons for optimism and reasons for thinking that actually, I mean, again, I'm not going to say we're in a new golden age or anything like that, but for thinking that we are in a time that is pretty fantastic for both filmmakers and lovers of film.
Yeah, I see your points, and I think that the reality is probably somewhere in the middle, as it almost always is. But yeah, regardless, I think that our discussion was probably a little bit more nuanced than just judging them all as despicable, or judging them all as being totally entertaining and above all reproach. I think there is reason to reproach them, but there's also reason, as you say, for optimism. So let us talk about next week's episode. What are we going to see? Nothing. We are going to stay at home and watch El Camino, the Netflix Breaking Bad movie, and we are pairing that with one of the better movies of a couple years ago, Hell or High Water. Until then, I am Jim.
And I'm Garrett.
And this has been
Jim and Garrett at the movies.
Good night, everybody.